one of the most famous Greek myths. Legend told of the ultimate monster, a half-man, half-bull that fed on human flesh. The Minotaur was so dangerous, it was hidden in the depths of a maze it couldn't escape, the Labyrinth. But then came the ultimate hero, Theseus, who ventured into the heart of the lair and slayed the beast. For thousands of years, most believed it was just a story. But could the tale of the Labyrinth, Theseus, and the Minotaur be true?
There is a physical, historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based.
One English archaeologist was determined to prove the myth was fact.
He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth.
And in his search, discovered a lost civilization.
The boundaries between prehistoric and historic were no longer hard and fast.
This is the story of Arthur Evans and his quest to unearth the Minotaur's lair, the Labyrinth. Arthur Evans was born in 1851 and grew up in the industrial town of Nashmills, 25 miles north of London. His father, John Evans, was a rich paper mill owner. But his real passion for geology made him one of the most distinguished scholars of the age. Young Arthur showed no signs of inheriting his father's intelligence, and when his mother unexpectedly died, the boy retreated into a world of imagination. He was gripped by tales from ancient Greece, and his favorite hero was Theseus, the Minotaur slayer. The Minotaur was the monster son of Minos, the king of Crete. Minos had defeated the king of Athens in battle, whose forfeit was to feed the grisly beast with the flesh of boys and girls.
His body was a man's, but his head was the head of a bull, and his teeth were teeth of a lion, and with them he tore his prey.
Prince Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, was determined to end the contract, and by killing the Minotaur, win the love of his father. But Minos had hidden the beast in a labyrinth beneath his palace. People went in, but no one ever came out.
He went down winding paths, among the rocks, under caverns and arches, over heaps of falling stone.
At the heart of the lair, Theseus found the Minotaur. And charged at the beast.
And drove the keen sword through his throat.
The Minotaur was dead. Theseus escaped into the sunlight. Young Evans had no idea the story would lead him to make one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. But by the age of 24, he'd had enough of just reading about adventure. He wanted to live it himself, to make his own mark on history. His father, the great John Evans, had set the bar high with his discoveries of Stone Age Britain.
All sons of great men struggle, and they struggle under their father's shadow, and I don't think Evans is any exception to that.
Evans was referred to as Little Evans, so I think this may have been a bit difficult for him.
Evans was determined to find a way to prove himself.
He sees himself as kind of an adventurous character out of a novel almost, because he's heading off for adventure, and he knows that it's going to be quite dangerous.
So he set off for the most treacherous place he could think of. the Balkan states of Eastern Europe, ruled by the crumbling Ottoman Empire. But things didn't go quite to plan. Evans was arrested on suspicion of spying for Russia. He was released, but went on to be jailed again, and was finally deported for encouraging rebellion. He'd had adventure, but despite it all, still hadn't found his real purpose. Back in England, Evans struggled to find a job until in 1884, family connections secured him a low-paid role in the backwaters of Oxford. He was now keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, in charge of a neglected collection of ramshackle antiquities. Action would be thin on the ground, but it was the ideal place to indulge his passion for ancient history, and, he hoped, find a subject to study that might enable him to match the achievements of his famous father. Evans's timing to make a name for himself couldn't have been better. Queen Victoria basked in the glow of a self-proclaimed golden age, ruling over an empire that stretched so far around the globe, it was said the sun never set on her domains. Britain saw itself as the intellectual capital of the world, inventing the steam engine, the telephone, and the first light bulb. Engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel were pushing the boundaries, with architectural feats like Paddington Station, the world's first underground railway, and the largest ship ever built, the Great Eastern. Scientists around the world were making headline news. Chemists were filling the periodic table with new elements at a rate of almost one a year. Darwin was questioning the origins of man. Whilst pioneers in the emerging field of archaeology focused on the question of where this impressive Western civilization had come from.
This is a moment when European countries, feel very powerful, and intellectuals turn toward historical questions with a kind of confidence or desire to organize the past. People want to systematically explore what's underneath the ground.
At the time, most people believed classical Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. Around 500 BC, the Greeks had invented an advanced culture. They'd influenced every European civilization since. The evidence was everywhere. Buildings, statues, art, literature, mathematics, science, as well as big ideas about the universe, democracy, crime and punishment. Some people doubted these had existed in Europe before the Greeks. Until archaeology began to overturn traditional beliefs. Evans had been captivated by news of Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist who had gone in search for the legendary city of Troy and found it in a Turkish hillside. Everyone thought it was a myth.
He notifies the world, this is it, I've discovered Troy.
The ancient Greek storyteller Homer had made the old folktale famous, telling of Paris of Troy, who eloped with Helen, the Queen of Sparta, sparking a bloody war between the Trojans and the Greeks.
And this is really the first moment when anybody starts to believe that these myths that survive from the classical period aren't just myths, but are based somehow in history.
That myth might be real created a press sensation. But Schliemann didn't stop there. He went on to the fortress at Mycenae in mainland Greece, where he claimed to discover the gold-rich tomb of its legendary king, Agamemnon, who'd led the Greek armies into the Trojan War.
Within the city walls, these very, very rich burials, one of which has this gold mask. And he said, "I've gazed upon the face of Agamemnon."
Mycenae was at least 1,000 years older than the classical Greek period. Were the origins of European civilization more ancient than previously believed?
He confirms that there is a physical historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based, and that is extraordinary.
Evans wasn't convinced Schliemann's discoveries were enough to rewrite the history books. So in 1883, he went to see the famous treasures for himself. But Evans quickly saw Schliemann was onto something. The treasures were clearly made with extraordinary skill. Coupled with impressive architecture and art, this was evidence of an ancient high culture.
You can see he's starting to realize, wow, wouldn't it be great to find a pre-Greek civilization that was the foundation of the classical era?
But Evans knew Schliemann was missing something vital, something all sophisticated societies had: writing.
Schliemann was looking for Mycenae rich in gold. He found the gold. Schliemann wasn't looking for script.
History was defined by what had been written down in the past. Anything that had happened before writing existed was just folklore. If the stories of ancient battles and mythical kings had been real, the people alive at the time must have had writing to record it. They'd have needed text to build palaces and fortresses, to make impressive jewelry. Amongst the rubble of Troy and Mycenae, there had to have been a script. Without it, there was no historical proof the Mycenaeans were the founders of European civilization, instead of the classical Greeks.
A couple buildings, a tomb, that's nice. Without a language, what do you have? Not a whole lot.
Evans saw his opportunity. If he could find a pre-Greek script, he would rewrite European history in a stroke. And he would no longer be little Evans. He would secure his place alongside his distinguished father.
Schliemann is getting all the headlines. His father had gotten all the headlines. I think Evans wanted to get his own headlines.
And so began Evans's quest to find the origins of Europe's high culture. It was a journey that would draw him into his favorite childhood story. If the Trojans, the Mycenaeans, and King Agamemnon had been real, was the Minotaur legend based on fact, too?
All these characters are real. Is Theseus real? Is the Minotaur then real? Perhaps there was Labyrinth.
1888, Oxford, England. Back at the Ashmolean Museum, Evans's theory remained just that. With no evidence of a pre-Greek script, he'd reached a dead end, until his first clue unexpectedly landed on his desk. A priest, the Reverend Greville Chester had donated his collection of ancient seal stones. He'd bought them in bazaars across Greece and the Middle East. Evans was told some of the stones may be from the area around Mycenae, and some had come from the island of Crete, the home of the Minotaur myth.
When Evans first gets his hands on them, he knows that there's a direct link through to what Schliemann's been finding on the Greek mainland.
They were small semi-precious stones, red and green jasper, amethyst, and cornelian, used to sign for goods or documents by stamping their imprint into clay or wax, like a signature. But as he examined them, Evans saw they were inscribed with minute images and symbols he had never seen before. Until now, these stones had just been collected as curios by wealthy tourists on their travels. But Evans wondered if the images could be the ancient writing he was looking for.
And one in particular clearly fascinates Evans. It is a prismatic stone. That is to say, each side has a different carving on it, and so a different sort of image is made by impressing each side. Evans spends a lot of time looking at this, and this is, I think, one of the pieces of evidence that builds the argument in Evans's mind that there is a language to translate.
The stones were an intriguing clue that writing may have existed before the classical Greeks. But Evans knew he'd need a lot more stones if he was going to identify a complete script. And he needed to prove, if it was a text, it was older than the Greek alphabet. His next breakthrough came on a trip to Rome, where he met a pioneering field archaeologist, Federico Halbert. He was an expert on the island of Crete. He told Evans that Cretan farmers regularly dug up ancient seal stones. All were inscribed with mysterious imagery and were worn by locals as necklaces. And he told Evans something else. The prime spot to find the stones was a place called Knossos. The site was rumored to hide the lost palace of the mythical king Minos, who built a labyrinth to contain the raging Minotaur. Evans was intrigued. It was dawning on him that the origin of the earliest European writing could be entwined with the Minotaur myth. And both mysteries might unravel at Knossos in Crete. But before he could even think about a dig, he wanted to decode the seal stone's secrets. And to prove the symbols were from a pre-Greek civilization, he needed more of them. A trip to Athens had paid dividends. He'd found stones just like the museum's gems in a flea market near the Acropolis. The merchants insisted they'd come from Crete. Evans was puzzled by the symbols. He could see pictograms of animals and people, as well as more abstract symbols that appeared in groups. All like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but quite unique. He had no way of telling which way they were read or what they said. But was he looking at a pre-Greek language?
He knows that they have something to say. They're going to tell a big story, and he wants to be the person to tell that story.
Evans had to take his research one step further, and that meant going to the source of the seal stones, Crete.
Evans was well versed in the ancient writings about Crete as he sails down to Crete for the first time. He must have been very, very excited. And as you come in from the west, he could actually see this landscape that he'd heard about from the ancient authors.
After 6 years studying the seal stones, Evans climbed the hill at Knossos in search for the remains of the legendary palace of King Minos, the home of the dreaded Minotaur.
You know, it's in the middle of an olive field. Things do grow over. It sort of looks like an abandoned archaeological site.
He jumps down into one of the trenches. These were very deep trenches. Down in the bottom, he finds the walls.
Evans made an instant discovery. He recognized symbols carved into the stone wall, the marks of an ancient world.
He sees engraved markings, in some cases identical to the hieroglyphic script that he's been looking at, working on, collecting, trying to figure out. This makes Evans realize here is direct evidence of the script.
A wall was engraved with symbols Evans had seen on some of the seal stones. There was now no doubt in his mind. Surely he was on the trail of the earliest writing in Europe. Then he made another discovery, which fired his imagination even more.
It all becomes very real for him because he sees what we call the double axe.
The double-headed axe was called a labyrinth, an ancient weapon, and some believed the sacred symbol of an early incarnation of the Greeks' greatest god, Zeus. Myth told of Minos and Zeus's alliance. Evans was convinced the mark proved the building had been Minos's palace. He believed the word labyrinth was very similar to the Greek labyrinth. Was there a connection? Was this the first stage in uncovering the truth about the Minotaur legend? Evans, a man of science, found himself becoming bewitched not just by the quest to find the origins of European civilization, but the desire to find out the truth behind the myth. To dig up Knossos' secrets, Evans had to get permanent access to the site. He realized he had to own the land.
As Evans stood on the hill at Knossos, he realized that if he was going to beat out all the other suitors, he had to own it. As he'd done with the seal stones, he had to own the artifact of the site itself. So he set about instantly trying to acquire it.
Evans left a local agent to land the deal and returned to Oxford to make an announcement. During Evans's travels around Crete, he'd bought a considerable number of seal stones. With more symbols to analyze, he'd managed to identify more than 80 different characters. And he suspected he'd found not one, but two variations of an early script.
He presents a paper basically saying that this is the earliest script in Europe. And so it's a huge, huge coup.
Evans had identified pictograms on some seal stones, images to signify animals and objects. But other stones had abstract symbols engraved in a line, a linear text. Evans wondered if this was the emergence of an alphabet.
For European scholars in 1894, the idea that there was this really, really early script that the Mycenaeans are using is a major breakthrough because this is part of their definition for civilization. If you're civilized, you write history.
It's huge because it's a publication that argues that there's an undiscovered language that he's brought to the surface. What it does is it stakes Evans's claim as a big player in that field.
Evans had a tantalizing glimpse of ancient writing that might predate classical Greece by thousands of years. He wondered if a Mycenaean civilization on Crete was the true cradle of Western Europe. But to prove it, he needed more evidence of writing than just seal stones. If this ancient society was advanced, it had to have had vast amounts of writing. There had to be literature, a script to govern an empire, on a material that could survive millennia, like clay tablets. Evans waited for news on his land sale. War was now brewing over Crete's independence from the Ottoman Empire. But he was undeterred. On the 6th of May, 1896, he paid out £235 for a quarter share of Knossos, equivalent to £22,000 in today's money. By law, he could now force the other owners to sell their shares and become the outright owner of the site.
There is a great sense of luck about Evans being there at the right time and having the money to buy the land at the right moment. And I think time and chance was everything as far as Evans was concerned.
Nobody else can come in and take the prize away from him. And so this is a huge moment for Evans. This is going to be his big discovery. This is what's going to turn him into Schliemann.
The Cretan conflict forced Evans to suspend his plans for 2 years. But by September 1898, the war was finally over. With the Ottomans expelled from the island, now at last, Evans could dig. But full access to Knossos wasn't going to be cheap. Buying just a quarter of the land had cleaned Evans out. To buy the rest and fund a dig, he wanted to raise a staggering £5,000, worth more than £500,000 today.
So Evans ends up being supported once again by his father, but his father gladly supports him. Evans may have been ambivalent about this, but he certainly accepts the aid.
With his money troubles solved, Evans went on a spending spree. London's Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus were the shopping destination for the well-heeled explorer. Here, gentlemen could buy guns, specialist canned foods, and the latest exploration clothing. And Evans wasn't going to economise. His shopping list totalled £56 and 1 shilling, the same as a worker's annual salary.
And so he's criticized for, having lavish tastes. He has champagne, he brings all his food out, hampers of all kinds of goodies.
(1900), Crete. After a long voyage by ship, Evans stepped ashore. He was now the outright owner of the site. But after 16 years as a museum curator, he was completely out of his depth.
Evans knows that he doesn't really have the digging expertise required to handle such a huge project. He may have felt a bit daunted by the whole thing. He needed somebody with experience.
Evans needed someone who spoke the local languages, could manage a vast number of workers, and document any finds. He knew the right man for the job.
So Evans sent a telegram to Duncan Mackenzie, and Mackenzie replied, yes, on the next boat, as it were. It was all very, very last minute.
And the contrast between the two men couldn't have been greater.
Duncan Mackenzie shows up, and of course he's the exact opposite to Evans. Evans is a diminutive, brunette, aristocrat. Duncan Mackenzie is a tall, red-headed Scot who loves drinking with the locals.
Unlike Evans, Mackenzie was an expert in the field. He'd spent years working as an archaeologist in Greece and spoke the language fluently. And unlike Evans, who had a degree in modern history, Mackenzie had studied philosophy and archaeology at university. Mackenzie hired diggers and the group set off for Knossos. It was a moment Evans had imagined for 6 years. By 11 a.m., the men had erected a tent headquarters, borrowed from the British Army, and run the Union flag up a pole in case anyone was in doubt who was in charge. Before noon, shovels of dirt were thrown from the hill. The first full-scale excavation of the palace of King Minos had begun. First off, Evans searched for the outline of the building, starting with the walls found decades before.
Evans was probably filled with apprehension. He spent so much money of his father's money. What if there's nothing there to find? What if he's completely wrong?
But as soon as Evans dug virgin ground in his second week, he hit the jackpot.
At the highest point of the site, there was a clay tub filled with inscribed tablets. This is something that nobody had ever found before in Greece or in Europe.
Evans discovered hundreds of clay tablets, many in pieces, inscribed with writing, a similar text to the seal stones, but far more advanced. Evans called it Linear B.
It's on a clay tablet, so it's not inscribed in stone. This indicates that there is a sort of a everyday use of language. He recognizes some symbols, but not all of them. He realizes that it's even more complex than he thought, which is, of course, thrilling to him.
And critically, a discovery of pottery meant Evans could date the clay tablets.
On the same day, they find a stirrup jar. A stirrup jar is a very specific kind of a pot that Schliemann had found many of at Mycenae. So it absolutely unequivocally connects the culture that Evans is digging at Knossos with what Schliemann has found at Mycenae.
The pottery was the same style as the Mycenaean finds on the mainland and dated to roughly 1400 BC. Linear B was at least 900 years older than the writing of classical Greece. For Evans, this was proof the Mycenaeans on Crete had invented Europe's high culture, not the more recent classical Greeks.
He's so delighted that he sends a telegram to the Times, but also to his father, and his father replies by sending him a huge sum of money to find more tablets.
The Times newspaper made the discovery public. And Evans's father was so proud, he wired a staggering £500 to his son to upscale the dig. But however grateful, Evans was anxious his famous father's support might cast a shadow on his rare moment in the spotlight.
Arthur Evans writes back to his father and says, thanks, and this is very good. He said, however, this is my excavation, and I have done this. This is my find. It's good to keep this in the family, but let's remember that this is mine. This was something that could not at all in any manner be connected with his father's accomplishment or status, but it was something he had made by himself.
John Evans's money was put to good use, and more tablets emerged from deeper in the ground. But Evans saw the writing on these clay tablets was different from Linear B. It seemed simpler and even older. He called it Linear A. Was this the missing link in the story of the script? Did Linear A bridge the gap between the symbols on the seal stones and the Linear B text? Evans was sure he'd discovered 3 stages of writing, developed by Europe's most ancient civilized society. It was an extraordinary feat and a personal breakthrough. Finally, he'd matched his father's achievements. He was now his own man.
He's making the sort of discovery that allows him to rise up shoulder to shoulder with his father.
But Evans was determined to go further. he wanted to reveal the root of the myth too. He wanted to find the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. 3 weeks in, the diggers were excavating a room filled with rubble when they discovered a fragment of a wall painting, a bull's hoof.
And this, of course, for Evans is the Minotaur. This is where Theseus went in to fight. You have the tangible evidence that you're holding in your hands that links through to the mythological story.
It was Evans's first glimpse of what could be a Minotaur. But where was the mythical king? In the same room, Evans made an even more remarkable discovery. Embedded into the opposite wall was an imposing stone chair.
He says, I have found the first throne of Europe. Thrones of Europe are important things, and Evans has found the first one. It must have been an extraordinary confirmation of Evans for all the risks he had taken.
For Evans, its owner was beyond doubt.
It's become the throne of Minos. It's the Labyrinth. Everything has to do with Minos. Minos and the Minotaur and Theseus.
But so far, no labyrinth. Evans kept digging. Finally, amongst the debris, cascading staircases, deep chambers, and long passages began to emerge.
So he's excavating through many small corridors and rooms. And this no doubt brings to mind this concept of the labyrinth, of course.
Evans, the man of science, believed he'd found King Minos' maze, but he wanted to find more evidence of the Minotaur. Then, on day 55 of the dig, the workers were dusting through the rubble when they shrieked out loud.
They find the relief head of a bull fresco where the bull is bellowing with the tongue hanging out, and they leap back and they're horrified because for them this is an image of the devil.
They'd found a three-dimensional lime plaster fresco, a raging life-size bull, nostrils flaring, poised to charge.
Evans sees this as really a confirmation that this is the head of the Minotaur.
This is literally, in 3 dimensions, an illustration from the mythological past. It's bringing that mythological interpretation of the site closer to the archaeological remains.
So you have the labyrinth, and not only that, but you have the imagery of the raging bull there on the walls in more than one place. The public must have been completely blown over by this.
The myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth had been based on something real, and he had found it. The convoluted building was the maze. The bull frescoes were the Minotaur. The throne belonged to the legendary Minos. He'd even found the image of the king in a fresco. Evans, once a man of science, had lost any reservations he may once have had about myth being true. It took Evans 31 years to expose the colossal building at Knossos. Covering an area of 22,000 square meters, it was the size of 3 football pitches. And it surrendered more artifacts than Evans could have imagined. Knossos was an engineering marvel, with a vast central courtyard, a grand staircase, and one of the oldest and best preserved ancient roads in Europe. A complex system of aqueducts, a sewage system, even the world's first flushing toilet. Evans had gone in search for the Mycenaeans, the oldest known advanced European civilization. But as his work on Crete progressed, he realized he'd found an even earlier society. He called the people of Knossos the Minoans. They were a highly sophisticated people who flourished from the 27th century BC, many hundreds of years before the Mycenaeans had existed. The writing of Crete had to be Minoan. In 1911, Evans was awarded a knighthood for services to archaeology. He was Little Evans no more, but the great Sir Arthur Evans. Over the years, Evans refined his theories. The idea of the Minotaur was great for generating newspaper headlines, but Evans had to admit it was more likely the Minoans had worshipped the bull as part of their religion. Maybe girls and boys had sailed from Athens not to be fed to the Minotaur, as myth said, but to jump bulls as a rite of passage. Could the building, with its countless rooms and corridors, have started the legend of a maze? Later archaeologists dismissed his model of the Great Palace of Knossos. Its design was a product of his imagination. He had ignored evidence suggesting a different story.
Evans discovered a new civilization. What he did with it was he turned it into the sort of civilization that he wanted. And he centered it around the Greek myths about Crete. He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth and what the mythology gave us.
Modern scholars don't believe Knossos was a palace, but a temple run by priestesses to worship gods and goddesses who ensured plentiful harvests. There had never been evidence of miners. Evans had found several fragments from different frescoes and created his king. The occupant of the stone chair is still unknown. So why had Evans, who prided himself on being a man of science, fitted the facts into his own picture of the past? Had he subconsciously acted out the true meaning of the Minotaur legend?
The Minotaur for the ancient Greeks was something that you had to enter the maze and overcome. In a sense, it was a part of themselves.
Had Evans lost his objectivity because of his psychological need to supersede his father? Had he and his hero Theseus been driven by the same desire to win the admiration of their father?
Yes, I will make him love me, for I will prove myself worthy of his love.
Probably what the Theseus myth is telling us about is going into a dark place, confronting this wild and untamed part of yourself, and then bringing it down, basically.
Theseus had killed the beast, and Evans had slayed his demons. He'd found Minoan writing, and what he believed was the origins of the Minotaur myth.
And he whispered, "It is done."
Evans made mistakes, but he was the first to recognize the importance of the seal stones, and his discovery of written clay tablets transformed our understanding of the origins of European civilization. After his death in 1941, Linear B, the advanced writing on the clay tablets, was finally translated. It was a sophisticated writing system with 187 characters. The tablets recorded the ownership of property by local people and their offerings to the Knossos temple. Evans had been convinced Linear B belonged to his great Minoans. But it was, in fact, Mycenaean. And astonishingly, it was the earliest form of the Greek language, at least 400 years older than the Greek alphabet. But why was the writing Mycenaean rather than Minoan? Today's scholars think they know what happened. The Minoans of Crete died out around 1450 BC. Then the mainland Mycenaeans arrived, and they discovered Minoan writing. The Minoans had been writing for centuries. Their script started as pictograms and hieroglyphs engraved on seal stones, and evolved into a more complex text written in lines, Linear A. To this day, the meaning of the hieroglyphs and Linear A is a mystery. But experts know the Minoans were writing 450 years before the Mycenaeans. 1,350 years before the classical Greeks. Evans had been right all along. Western Europe's civilization didn't start with classical Greece. It didn't even start with the Mycenaeans. It all began with the even more ancient Bronze Age Minoans, and we only know about them because of Arthur Evans.
We now have a chance to look at this golden age and look at the art from this period and the wonderful architecture from this period and realize that this was a really spectacular time for humans.
Evans had discovered a long-lost civilization, and in finding Minoan and Mycenaean writing, had left his own mark on history.